We've still got a few more people joining us, but I think we'll start as it's 10:01 now. Thank you for joining us on this sunny Monday morning, and I hope you're going to really enjoy the session that we've got coming up with one of our memcom partners, one of our platinum partners, Wattle. I'm going to hand over very shortly to Dave Abrahams, who's going to be conducting the webinar this morning. But if you've got any questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A as we go along. We'll also be answering questions at the end. So if there's anything you want to ask them, please do. I'm going to hand over now to Dave, who's going to be talking us through managing change at speed, which is something we've all had to get used to lately very quickly. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Right, let's turn on the presentation. Screen share away. Good morning, everybody. I am Dave Abraham. I'm the Managing Director of Wattle. Just going to introduce the company before we dive into the agenda for today's webinar. So Wattle are a software company based in Bristol. We work with membership organizations, associations, not-for-profits, predominantly on digital transformation programs and the implementation of technology. We have an offering based around the Microsoft stack called Memex. Here's a sample of some of the types of organizations that we work with, a variety of everything from Chartered Institutes to not-for-profits, as I previously mentioned. So today we're going to be talking about the topic of managing change at speed, and there's no time where the ability to change quickly has been more important. To put some context around that, back in 2019, Forbes was stated to say that 55% of businesses believe that they have less than a year before they start to suffer financially and lose market share as a result of failing to respond. And that was failing to respond to digital transformation. And this quote was pre-pandemic. And we know that organizations are going through unprecedented amounts of change. So I'm not sure what that percentage would look like today. We're also going to be focusing around a case study today of a client where we implemented a complex digital transformation program at a very, very rapid pace, under 12 months, in fact. So we'll contextualize some of the points in discussion points today using that case study. So we're going to cover developing a business case, creating a project team, running internal discovery sessions prior to establishing supplier relationships. We're going to talk a bit about the role of strategic planning, and then, as I say, contextualize that with some discussion around where this particular case study ended up after 12 months. So where to start on a digital transformation program? So in the first instance, understanding the business problems that we're trying to solve is absolutely critical. I think a lot of organizations will embark on a digital transformation program in a very technology focused way, i.e. they'll say we need a CRM system, we need to implement a new website, and it's very outcome focused. But I think in the first instance, it's really important that we understand what the business problems are that we're actually trying to solve as an organization. Why are we embarking on a program of digital transformation in the first instance? Once we understand the why, we then really need to start looking at getting buy-in from across the business, and this is a really important point. In a lot of organizations, these types of programs come from the top down, often from management, and what we want to be looking to achieve really is buy-in from the rest of the organization at a department level, in fact, and an individual user level, that we need to embark on a digital transformation program, and an understanding of the reasons why we're doing it. So coming back to point one, understanding the problems. We need to understand our members as well. It's quite common that we receive very well thought out business cases that have been created for digital transformation programs, inviting tenders to submit potential solutions. And often it's a very introverted view of what that business problem actually is. It's very rare that we see an understanding of the external needs to the organization from the actual members themselves. The technology that we're implementing may well be solving business problems for our organization, but more often than not, it's external people which are interacting with that technology, and we really need to be taking a view of what your members need from the technology that we're implementing as well. Ask them, talk to them, engage with them, and we'll cover a bit more about that in the strategy side of things as we move to that slide. Ultimately, understanding the business problems, getting buy-in from the organization, and trying to take a view of how your members are going to interact with that technology will enable us to be able to build a business case. And looking at that in practice with the case study that I was talking about, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, they started with some real key business challenges, which was related to the implementation of legacy systems and business processes. They had a mind-boggling amount of technology implemented within the organization. And I'm sure that this is something which isn't unfamiliar to people watching this. Each department had its own collection of technology, and there was very little integration between those pieces of technology. If you were to pick on any one individual system within the organization that was implemented, there was often a good reason in isolation why that system existed, but it introduced some real key challenges with the integration of those platforms for achieving the outcome of having a single source of truth when it related to a member data. And the problem was compounded by the fact that this organization was an international organization, 80 branches across the globe, each with that problem in isolation as well. Everything from disconnected financial processes, which resulted in an inability to be able to report financially across the organization, reconciliation across multiple bank accounts, and the integration of member data was incredibly challenging. So they created a business case focused around having a single source of truth, a core central system, a customer relationship management system, which provided that centralized single point of member data within the organization. That was the utopian objective, so that any additional systems which were required for things like finance, governance, and education and training, membership, marketing would integrate back into that. That didn't necessarily mean there should be one system, but there certainly should be one source of truth of member data. Another thing that they decided to do was make a decision over the MVP or the Big Bang approach. What I'm talking about there is, should we do this in all in one go, or should we look at a longer roadmap of change within the organization? It's not uncommon for us to encounter organizations that have digital transformation programs which span years, in some instances 5, 6, 7 years. Again, I'm sure some people will be familiar with that, versus attempting to do this all in one go. In this particular case, under 12 months, this organization decided that the needs of the business and the members were so great that they decided that they wanted to do this in one go. The Big Bang approach there isn't necessarily a right answer to whether or not you should stagger out this level of change, but the only thing that I will highlight is that technology moves quickly. So if you're looking at a transformation program over a 3-4 year period, for example, the pace of change with technology needs to be factored into that decision that you're making. So the very first step here will be building your team. So number one, building a core internal team with a clear owner, and I'm going to emphasize the words clear owner. We've seen lots of ways of structuring internal teams, from very formal processes of steering groups and committees for spearheading digital transformation within organizations, but ultimately the most successful projects that we work on, the most successful organizations that we work with, have a clear internal owner of change within the organization, running the program of digital transformation. A lot of the organizations that we work with are very departmentalized, obviously, in terms of decision making. So often organizations are used to making decisions as a group of people. You'll pull people together into a room and make a group decision, which in a lot of cases will work. But from a technology perspective, the best outcomes that we see are where there is a clear owner internally, a clear decision maker. We want to involve the rest of the business and other people within the organization, but we certainly need to empower an individual with the ability to be able to make decisions. Our case study that we're talking through today, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, did exactly that within the organization. They appointed an individual who was empowered to be able to make decisions across the whole organization. Ensure that you've got a clear resource plan based upon milestones. Change is hard. Digital transformation is hard, and no matter what anybody tells you, we want to make it clear that it will require internal resources from your organization. Understanding the resource needs of your organization up front will be a critical part of success. So really understanding at what point you're going to need to put input, and from where within the organization you need to put that input into the project's important. A common thing that can stall the progress of a project is the inability to be able to obtain resources from within an organization that are necessary to that particular phase of a project. So if we understand upfront what the resource requirements are from your organization, and we can pre-plan for those in advance, then we can help to mitigate that. You want to make sure that your team have the required skill set. A really probably really important point. I mentioned before about having a clear appointed owner within an organization, but if, for example, that owner of the project doesn't have the necessary skill set to manage the complexity of that project, external supplier relationships, internal teams, building business cases, then really we should be looking externally to bring those skill sets in. Working with partner organizations, consultants, even temporary contractors isn't uncommon to bring into an organization to bridge some of those skill gaps that we may have within the organization. And we want to be sure that we also involve the entire business in the project. As many people as possible, in fact. So rather than just working with individual departments and department heads, if we can engage end users within departments as much as possible, whether or not that's through surveying them, involving them in discovery and workshop sessions, but absolutely involve as much of the business in the process, that we obtain their buy-in to the project as well. Some of the most successful digital transformation programs that we worked on have been where organizations have invested internally in their own internal discovery prior to engaging on the project and prior to even appointing a supplier or defining the solution. So some of the most organized and successful projects have invested in that process up front. And that can start by internally mapping your own business processes, looking at what your organization currently does, how they do it, who they do it for, and literally mapping it out on paper, flow charts. So understanding what you currently do, your as-is processes, and then looking at what you would like those processes to be. Naturally, the to-be processes will change if you're engaging with an external supplier and conducting discovery as you gain their input into the processes, but clearly understanding what you do, mapping that out, and flowcharting that on paper is an important part of the process. Previously mentioned about understanding your members and really emphasizing that here, understanding your members and their needs in terms of input into what you're trying to achieve within the project. If you have the opportunity to be able to conduct any form of external focus groups or surveys with external users, we really need to be looking at the people externally which are going to be utilizing technology that we're implementing as part of a digital transformation program, and understanding the input that understanding their needs within the project as well. You want to work closely with stakeholders to extract business knowledge, and that should be at a department level. So we were saying involve the whole organization. You know, when you're conducting internal discovery sessions, run your own literal roundtable workshops at a department level if it's possible to do so. The size of your organization enables it. Literally bring a department in, membership, marketing, legal, finance, whoever it may be, and talk to the whole of the department to understand those processes, rather than just taking it from a department head. Sometimes the size of the organization might be restrictive in that regards, but often what a department manager thinks is a business process, it can differ when you start engaging with the end users and actually find out how they're doing something or what their business processes are. So the more people that we can involve and the more stakeholders we can bring in at a department level, the better. Which ties into that final point about involving those departmental teams within the organization. At that point, we can start looking at establishing supplier relationships, external people who can help us with the implementation of a digital transformation program within the organization. We want to be really focusing on creating long-term partnerships with those organizations. So as opposed to seeing it as the implementation of a CRM system, external suppliers can provide more value on from a long-term relationship perspective. So we want to be looking at creating a long-term strategic partnership with an external organization if we're going to externally source somebody to implement the technology to support a digital transformation program. Controversial point, working with a single supplier where possible. Now, we would say that because we're a supplier of integrated solutions, which is CRM systems and websites, but I'm going to abstract myself away from being a supplier of services for a second and explain the two possible approaches to this, and where my opinion comes from on that. So you could look at a digital transformation program and break it down into individual needs of technology. So very, very common that it will involve, for example, a website and a CRM system. We're picking on the two very basic things there, but it could also involve the implementation of a finance system, HR, marketing platforms, for example. Excuse me. So it's reasonable if you were looking at mitigating risk within a project to think about de-risking the project by not putting all your eggs in one basket and working with multiple suppliers to implement those solutions for you, which is viable. That is a way of mitigating risk. The challenge that that I think that introduces probably outweighs that risk mitigation, which is that if the purpose of the digital transformation program in the first place is the streamlining of process and the integration of systems and creating a single source of truth, as it was in the case of this case study with Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, we're introducing complexity whereby we're asking multiple unrelated organizations to combine together and create that single source of truth, which is possible, but it becomes more difficult. From a risk perspective, if we jump down to the last point there, prioritizing a single technology stack, from a risk mitigation perspective, we can mitigate risk by ensuring that our investment in a single stack of technology, which is globally supported, mitigates the problem of having to put all of your eggs in one basket with an individual single supplier. So what I'm talking about there with a single technology stack is worth a discussion in a webinar all on its own. It's a much wider topic, but if we pick on our scenario, the implementation of a CRM system and a website and a marketing platform, for example, if you were to work with multiple external suppliers, it's possible that if you take that approach that you could end up with a situation where you've got a CRM system built on Microsoft.net. I've skipped forward a slide there. A CRM system built on Microsoft.net and a website built in PHP, which individually could be fit for purpose on day one. The challenge that introduces in the long run, though, is a problem in respect to ongoing cost of ownership, and in fact those supplier relationships. If you decide to consolidate your supplier relationships, you've got to find somebody that can work across multiple stacks of technology, which is actually an incredibly difficult thing to do. To find somebody to support different underlying technology stacks is incredibly challenging. So I think it is easier and less risk to opt for a single supplier and a single stack of stack of technology. And it doesn't matter what that stack of technology is. If you were going to invest in a PHP website, it'd be better to keep your ecosystem, your underlying stack of technology within that same ecosystem, because ultimately in the future, if we decide to bring it in-house, for example, the number of human resources that we would need to achieve that would be far fewer than if we had an eclectic mix of different stacks of technology. Skipped right ahead there. Okay. So focusing on Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, they obviously appointed us, hence why they're the case study. They formed a genuine partnership with Wattle. Both of those organizations were invested in each other. They had a direct relationship with the Wattle project team. Constant communications, quick outcomes. A key thing that really helped us implement change at speed with this organization was actually forming that relationship through having co-located teams. So we made sure that our consultants were on site at least 3 days per week. In some instances, they were there much more than that, particularly when we were coming towards the later stages of the project. So having somebody on site with that organization made an enormous difference to the success of that project, and that was through building that strong relationship and really understanding and engaging with the different departments within the organization through that on-site presence. The Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, to their credit, really embraced being challenged. So as an organization to work with, they had a clear understanding of the business problems and had a very strong business case for digital transformation within the organization. But when we were working with them, particularly in the early stages of the project, they certainly embraced being challenged on what the solutions should be within the organization. When we're engaging on a program of digital transformation, we want to be leading with strategy. Insight and data should be at the core of our discovery processes. Most people will be familiar with, if you pick on building a website, for example, taking an analytical approach to defining what your new website should be. We can very easily obtain web statistics, and it's become quite common for people to be able to take, for example, Google Analytics data and allow them to be able to make decisions on what the new site should be, and that should 100% form a part of any digital transformation program. But I'm talking about looking at data across the board to validate any of the business problems that we're solving. So, for example, pick on something like the automating of an online renewal process, and then the integration of that renewal process back into CRM, and subsequently the integration into a finance system. Now, we can make an assumption that the integration of those systems will increase productivity and member satisfaction. The member doesn't have to pick up the phone, or there's no manual processes internally. But if we can find ways of measuring the productivity savings within the internal organization, the cost of human resource in the manual processing of that data, that can better inform us in terms of the priority of that individual requirement. Because what we should then be doing is looking at creating detailed user stories with defined outcomes as to what we're looking to achieve. When I'm talking about user stories, I'm talking about agile management there. So each phase of that journey that I just broke down there has different potential personas in terms of the people that could be interacting with that business process. You've got the member, you've got somebody potentially in the membership team, you've potentially got a user in the finance team as well, and their needs will vary dependent upon the persona. So understanding what each individual persona, what each individual user interacting with that piece of technology needs, and what the actual outcomes should be. If we can align that to data, that will enable us to have a much more strategic way of the implementation of that piece of technology. So what I'm talking about there is, if, for example, it takes a person in the membership team a day to manually process and update spreadsheets within the organization, an outcome might be to define the reduction in time it takes human resource to be able to process that information. So we can make our objectives outcome based, we'll see a lot more success. We should be focusing on a long-term agile roadmap with clear priorities. Agility within these programs and being able to adapt to change throughout the life cycle of a digital transformation program is absolutely critical. And I think that our current situation with a global pandemic really highlights that. If we were working to a static linear timeline and a global pandemic had hit within our organization, it would be very difficult for us to be able to adapt and change our priorities. And we're taking an extreme end of the spectrum there in terms of things that can happen. But obviously it was a very real situation which has occurred. It's quite common for priorities and things to change throughout the life cycle of a digital transformation program, and being able to adapt to change with by taking an agile approach to that project is absolutely critical from our perspective. Shifting priorities and changing priorities isn't uncommon, but if we have detailed user stories with clear outcomes, and we understand the data behind why we're making those decisions, being able to refocus those priorities becomes easier than if it was a linear roadmap. We want to plan for now and in the future as well. Nobody has a crystal ball. We can't say what's going to happen in 2-3 years from now, but we can certainly take a best guess, and a clear example of that is, again, the current situation that we're in now. And we were working with organizations last year which deprioritized finance systems integration, for example. And that became front and center in March once lockdown had happened, and we had a massive spike in needing to prioritize issues related to financial systems integration. I think had we, well, now we understand the extreme end of what can happen within an organization, we can plan for that in the future as well. Data and content migration is a key consideration in the planning phases. It's an often overlooked point within these types of projects. If the outcome was the implementation of an empty system, the projects would be significantly smaller in size, because one of the most time-consuming parts of these projects is actually the migration of existing data, and often the deduplication of, the cleansing of that data into that single source of truth is a key consideration in the planning phase, and often just sits as a one line in a set of requirements. We must migrate the data from the legacy systems, but really we need to be thinking about that in detail and understanding what data we're migrating. Are we migrating all data, some of the data into the system, and how we're actually going to approach that, and what strategy we're using for the implementation of that data. And that strategy won't only be technical, it will be making decisions about what data you want to store that's held in legacy platforms. We were working with an organization that recently launched a project at the beginning of lockdown. Actually, it was within the first 4 weeks of lockdown happening, and one of their initial requirements that sat as a user story within the backlog was the migration of all legacy activity data. So if somebody had been previously phoned, which actually is important from a marketing team's perspective, but they decided in the end to deprioritize that over finance systems integration. But it was a massive task. There were millions of rows of legacy data which needed to be, quite literally millions of rows of legacy data which needed to be imported into the system, and that had sat as a single line requirement within the initial project requirement documentation, and it actually probably accounted for somewhere in the region of 15% of the project costs. Do not underestimate data and content migration. It is a key consideration that should be factored into the initial planning phases of your project. So looking at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, within 12 months, the project had been completed with the launch of a website, member portal, and customer relationship management system. All of those systems were integrated alongside other key external systems for education and training as well, and finance, in fact. We re-engineered key processes and factored them into the system. The organisation recorded an increase of in excess of £500,000 in invoice membership income, and to qualify that, what that actually related to was the renewal processes. So historically, the renewal processes were very manual and disconnected across those 80 global branches. With the consolidation of technology, centralization, and automation of those renewal processes, the project actually paid for itself within the first 3 months of launching it in increased membership renewals. So the first renewal run that ran on it was incredibly successful through automation and integration predominantly. And that was it. So that's the end of my presentation today. So thank you very much for everybody that was watching. I think Debbie's going to jump back on.
I am indeed. We've had a question in the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators case study example. What do you mean with re-engineered key processes?
So you might remember on one of the slides I was talking about how the organisation wasn't afraid to be challenged. So a lot of the processes that they had identified at the beginning, we sat down with them during a discovery phase and mapped out the to-be business processes. So we looked at what they currently do and then what they should be doing. Part of the value that a supplier with sector expertise can provide is not in just taking a requirement and implementing the solution at face value. What we try to do is bring our past experience and expertise that we have within the sector and challenge those organizations on what those processes are. And more often than not, that will result in a re-engineering of some of those processes. And what we're talking about there is us actually helping the organization adapt and change those processes to fit the new systems based upon our experience and expertise within the sector. So when working with an external supplier and selecting a supplier, finding somebody with sector expertise who can add value by bringing experience that they have specific to the sector will help, particularly when analysing existing business processes.
Great, thank you. I think that's the only question we've had so far. Is there one thing you'd like to leave the audience with, one particular message that you'd like to sort of get across in terms of this process?
Yeah, so I think involving people is probably the key thing within the organisation. So I've mentioned several times about engaging with people within the organisation. This shouldn't be a management initiative, just a management initiative which comes from the top down. Involve as many people within the organisation, both internal and external. Internal employees of the organisation and volunteers where necessary, and external members. Involve people within the process and you'll see better outcomes. Yes,
I think that's a good message for all sorts of projects, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's great, thank you. And we'll be sharing the slides with the audience, so we'll send those across to you. Yeah, thanks for everybody for joining us this morning. Thanks to Dave at Wattle and for Hannah. And yeah, hope you'll join us for other sessions again soon. Thanks
Thank you very much,
everybody.